Welcome to the Dragon of Forgotten Myths channel. Here we travel back in time together so that you can fall asleep safely and usefully. Don't forget to subscribe and like it. By the end of this lecture, sleep will cover you firmly and confidently. Close your eyes. The story is already beginning. Grigory Rasputin is one of the most famous Russians in the whole world. Even people who can't find Russia on the map still know Rasputin's name. To some extent, it is worth thanking the Jamaican-German band Boney M and its rousing song. For us, Gregory has remained a mystery figure for more than a century, a man whom no one has been able to fully understand. The elder still causes fierce controversy. The main question is, who was he really? A saint in an immoral world, or a clever deceiver who led the royal family by the nose while not giving up orgies and debauched parties? And that's the main difficulty. Neither excessive praise nor indiscriminate criticism gives the right answer. Almost all of Gregory's life is shrouded in myths and speculation. And towards the end of his journey, literally the whole of Russia turned against him. The clergy, officials, liberals, socialists, and even the monarchy itself. In this issue, we will try to look at the elder's life objectively, without extremes, no insults, no extellations. We will try to understand why he was loved and hated, figure out how a peasant from the Siberian hinterland became a global figure, and reveal his real name. We will put an end to the story of his sexual adventures, and, most importantly, we will tell you the name of a man whom you know very well, but did not suspect that he was the author of the myth of Rasputin. The internet is full of fictions about this man. Many documents are related to his murder, but there is still no answer to the main question. How did a simple peasant, Grigory Rasputin, end up at the helm of Europe's most powerful empire? Grigory Rasputin's childhood is shrouded in mystery. It is only known that he was born in the village of Pokrovsky in the Tobolsk province. Today, it is the territory of the Tyumen region. Later, he found faith and began to wander. The facts actually end there. It is important to understand that there is so little information about his early years, not because he himself hid the details. On the contrary, Rasputin willingly talked about how he came to the life of a wanderer. But whether to believe these stories or not is an open question. Almost everything we know about him is rumors and retellings. This will have to be put up with throughout the story. Those who hate the elder believe in the darkest stories, while his supporters, on the contrary, choose convenient legends for themselves. All this is very similar to how myths and conspiracy theories work. Why did it turn out that way with Rasputin? It's simple. There is almost no reliable information about the early stage of his life. He was an ordinary peasant from western Siberia, and the biography of such people was at best limited to a few lines in church metric books: birth, wedding, death. In the case of Gregory, it's the same. Most of the information about his childhood and youth came from the mouths of Rasputin himself and his daughters. But it is impossible to accept their stories as the pure truth. There are also memoirs of journalists and curious researchers who came to Pokrovskoye and questioned the old-timers. But these are just retellings, no more reliable than the legends about the sinking of Kitezh and the atomic bombings of the 19th century. The information about him is so confusing that for a long time even the year of birth remained unknown. Rasputin himself was confused in his testimony. In the eyes of the court elder, he needed the image of a wise and respectable old man, so he deliberately added age to himself. It wasn't until the late 1990s that they found a metric book with an accurate record. He was born in 1869. It turns out that at the time of meeting the royal family, the gray-haired elder was only 36 years old, the same age as Nicholas II, even a year younger than him. Interestingly, Rasputin is not exactly his real last name. After moving to St. Petersburg and meeting the imperial family, he turned to Nicholas II for help. In his native village of Pokrovsky, Rasputin's surname was literally worn by half the village, and Grigory was tired of it. The Tsar met them halfway. Officially, he became Grigory Rasputinovich. However, the second part of the surname never caught on. Let's go back to Pokrovskoye. As the heir to the farm, young Grigory had a great responsibility, but he did not strive to meet expectations. Since childhood, he was sickly, dreamy, strange, and in the company of his peers he was often beaten and humiliated. Later, he became addicted to drinking and could steal small things. The villagers recalled his father sent him to Tyumen to buy bread and hay, more than 80 miles away, and he returned on foot, without money, beaten, and even tipsy, often without a horse. During one of the fights, he suffered a serious head injury. According to the neighbors, he became even more weird after that. Gregory himself claimed that he had then experienced an experience close to death and felt the joy of suffering. His admirers believed that this moment was the turning point, the beginning of his path to God. Skeptics see this as either an attempt to justify horse theft or a convenient explanation for strange behavior. However, there are no records of horse thefts, and in the conditions of a Siberian village, such a sin would have ended in immediate lynching. There is indirect evidence of changes. Fellow villagers recalled that he behaved extremely strangely in church. He sang in a wild voice, shook his fists at the devil, and in winter he could run around the village in only a shirt. Rasputin himself said that at the age of 28, Saint Simeon of Verkhoturia appeared to him and commanded, "Wander and save people." So he became a wanderer, going on foot for hundreds and thousands of kilometers to holy places. His 30-year-old wife, Praskovia, was waiting for him at home. She married him when she was already an old maid. They had many children, but only 3 survived: daughters Maria and Varvara, and son Dmitri. Praskovia herself had no place in this story. While Grigory was wandering, she obediently waited for him in the village. It is important to understand that at that time, wandering was not something extraordinary. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were up to 1 million wanderers in Russia, almost one of the empire's population. They moved from one holy place to another. For the authorities, the wanderers were a suspicious category. It was difficult to distinguish them from the runners, one of the movements of the Old Believers. They completely rejected the state, considering it a sin to pay taxes, serve in the army, and receive documents. The life of a wanderer was not easy. There were authorities and robbers on the roads. Rasputin also experienced all this. One day on his way from Pokrovsky to Verkhotursky Monastery, now in the north of the Sverdlovsk region, he was ambushed. The robbers took almost everything. But it was not a tragedy for him. In Verkhoturia, he met a real elder for the first time. The phenomenon of old age is a purely Russian phenomenon, and it is difficult to find an exact analog in other cultures. In some ways they resembled Oriental mentors, but with a pronounced religious bias. These people were neither monks nor official teachers. But the miracles attributed to the elders convinced ordinary people of one thing: such a person lives on a special level of communion with God. Grigory Rasputin absorbed this tradition. For him, the elders became models, and meeting them was a confirmation of his own destiny. All this reinforced his belief that he was chosen to help people and lead them to salvation. Do you know what role the elders played in the history of Russia? It is enough to recall Sergius of Radonej, whose name is associated with the blessing and victory of Dmitry Donskoy on Kulikovo Field. The 19th century became a real golden age of old age. Seraphim of Sarov and the elders of the Optina Desert were incredibly respected. The imperial government listened to them, and Dostoevsky wrote, "By choosing an elder, a person completely renounces his will and gives it into complete obedience." When Grigory Rasputin found himself in Verkhoturia, he met Elder Macarius and quickly entered his entourage. Macarius became a mentor for him, which in the future became a weighty argument in favor of Gregory's spiritual authority. After all, if he was with such a great man, it means that he himself possessed a special gift. But Verkhoturia was only the first stage of his travels. In 1900, together with the pilgrims, Rasputin set out on a journey to the west. For 6 months he walked to the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, and then headed even further, to Greece. Just imagine how many kilometers he traveled on foot, and how many months, if not years, he spent on the road. Gradually, his own circle of supporters began to form around him. When Grigory returned to his native village for a short time, the villagers already looked at him with respect. As a result, he gathered about 10 loyal followers, something like a demo version of his future seniority. He gathered people on Sundays, interpreted the scriptures, and meetings were held in a small chapel they had dug underground, as if in ancient catacombs. But along with this, rumors began to spread. They said that Gregory conducts strange rituals, and also goes to the bathhouse with several novices. He also had his first serious opponent, the local priest Peter Ostromov. He tried to destroy Grigory's circle, but to no avail. Rasputin's influence soon surpassed the authority of the official priest. This was only the beginning of his struggle for spiritual influence. However, not all the clergy were hostile to him. Already a well-known wanderer, he managed to impress Bishop Chrysanthos of Kazan, who sent him to Bishop Sergius, rector of the St. Petersburg Theological Academy. Sergius would later become patriarch and become close to Stalin during the war. And then, in 1903, when Rasputin turned 33, he went to conquer St. Petersburg for the first time. He found the capital in an atmosphere of mystical fascination. In Russia, a simple person could touch God not only through the official church, but also through the fools. These not of this world were considered especially close to the Lord, and through their mouths, it was believed, the Almighty himself spoke. Today, the Russian Orthodox Church honors 36 holy fools. The fools were treated with great respect. They were kept at court, listened to, and sometimes they were the only ones who could openly tell the princes and czars the bitter truth. In 1570, for example, Ivan the Terrible was going to execute the inhabitants of Pskov, but the local fool Nikolka Salos threw the Tsar a piece of raw meat with the words, "Eat, because you eat human meat." Grozny stopped the massacre after that, and even asked to pray for him. The power of the fools was enormous. They could even denounce the autocrats and stay alive. Moscow St. Basil's Cathedral, by the way, is named after a fool who walked around the city naked and allowed himself to reproach the Tsar for his cruelty. Their path was considered a reflection of the life of Christ: poverty, faith, and fearless condemnation of authority. But time was changing. After the reforms of Peter the Great, the court stopped listening to the fools. The era of enlightened rule came. Although, in fact, the Russian monarchs remained very superstitious. Anna Ivanovna, for example, found time for God's people between playing with dwarfs. Over time, the prophets were replaced by secular magicians and mystics. To Catherine II, for example, Potemkin brought the famous adventurer Cagliostro. But the Empress ridiculed him in her own play, The Deceiver, and he hurried to leave Russia. Her successor Paul VI, on the contrary, surrounded himself with prophets and mystics. There is a famous case when the monk Abel predicted his imminent death. Pavel wrote down what he had heard and ordered the records to be opened after 100 years. According to legend, Nicholas II had already done this. By the middle of the 19th century, spiritualism had spread in Russia. Spirit-summoning sessions and Ouija boards have become fashionable in high society. People moved a pointer across the board, asked questions to the spirits, and they allegedly answered by making up words and dates. It was a new kind of entertainment, replacing the boring balls and Masonic gatherings. The Church strongly condemned such practices, but the authorities and the nobility continued to be fascinated by them. Even Alexander II arranged spiritualistic seances. With the English medium Hume, he tried to communicate with the spirit of his father, Nicholas III. Contemporaries recalled how during one session, the table suddenly rose, spun and rattled, beating the rhythm of the anthem, "God Save the Tsar." It is not surprising that in such an atmosphere of mysticism and fascination with occult practices, the last royal couple, Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra Feodorovna, were also exposed to these trends. The Empress was especially keen on this. It was her passion for mysticism that played a decisive role in the fate of Grigory Rasputin. The problem was that Nicholas and Alexandra had not had a son heir for a long time, and the age was already approaching a critical point. The couple had passed their 30s. In the absence of the heir to the throne, all kinds of miracle workers and mystics began to appear at court. Rasputin was far from the first. The first was Matron Bosanoshka, a peasant seer known throughout Russia. She was brought to Tsarskoye Selo, where she spent hours whispering prayers and conspiracies to Alexandra Feodorovna so that she would finally give birth to a son. But when only a daughter, Anastasia Nikolaevna, was born after that, Matrona's popularity declined sharply, and soon she was almost no longer invited to court. Another wizard was a Frenchman named Philippe Nizier. His task was to predict whether the royal couple would have a long-awaited heir. Together with his pupil Pappus, he even arranged a séance and evoked the spirit of Emperor Alexander III. He allegedly stated that in the event of an uprising, the government must be defended with maximum brutality. Nizier knew how to impress the audience. So, Felix Yusupov's father, Sumarokov Elston, once met the Montenegrin Princess Militia in the company of Nizier. He bowed, but she didn't seem to notice him. To the question, "Why?" she simply answered, "You couldn't see me because I was with Dr. Philip. When he puts on his hat, he becomes invisible, and so do those around him." Emperor Nicholas was so impressed by the Frenchman's talents that he asked the French government to grant Nizier a doctorate. But in Paris, the offer was considered ridiculous and refused. Then Nikolai decided to act in his own way and got him awarded the degree of Doctor of Medicine already in Russia. The exam was a farce. Nizier walked around the hospital wards, waved his hand over the patients, and announced, "I cured everyone. Don't thank me." And he got his diploma. However, he was soon suspended from the court. Among the strange characters was a real fool, Mitka Zelsky. He suffered from many diseases, lameness, deafness, epilepsy, as well as serious developmental disorders. He always had an assistant named Elpidifor with him. Elpidiferus translated his speeches, or rather, he said what he considered necessary. But Mitka's career at court ended quickly. During one of his seizures, he scared the Empress so much that she almost lost her child. There were also more exotic characters. For example, the Tibetan physician Jemsaran Badmaev, who practiced Oriental medicine. He was trying to alleviate the suffering of the little Tsarevich Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia. His methods seemed to help, but Badmaev's background and obsessive political ideas irritated everyone at court. He even suggested that Nicholas annex Tibet to Russia. In general, by the time Grigory Rasputin appeared, the courtyard was already warmed up by mysticism. Everyone was waiting for someone charismatic and unusual. The illness of the heir, the Empress's interest in the supernatural, and the general crisis in society all set the stage for the appearance of the elder figure. In February 1904, the Russian-Japanese War began, which, by the way, none of the former magic advisors predicted. It was then that Rasputin's star began to rise. In St. Petersburg, he quickly found supporters among the clergy. John of Kronstadt, one of the most respected and influential priests in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century, became a particularly significant figure for him. He was considered almost a prophet and a miracle worker. Moreover, it was his sermons that became the ideological basis for the Black Hundreds. With their actions, the world learned the word pogrom for the first time, and it even entered the Oxford Dictionary. After arriving in the capital, Rasputin settled in the House of Pilgrims at the Alexander Nevsky Lavra. Here he made his first connections and began to enter high society. Reading prayers and stories about pilgrimages, it would seem, should not have impressed secular aristocrats, but Rasputin knew how to present himself as a prophet and a miracle worker. The Russian-Japanese War suddenly became a chance for him. One successful prediction was enough, at a time when the whole country was waiting for at least some kind of answer to be known as a prophet. And so it happened. Rasputin predicted the defeat of the Russian squadron at Tsushima. And although the probability of the outcome was clear to many, even before the battle, it was this prophecy that cemented his reputation as the chosen one. In May 1905, the Montenegrin princesses Milisa and Stana, who were influential at court, became interested in him. They became his patrons and literally promoted Rasputin. On November 1st, 1905, Gregory had his first meeting with the royal couple. He brought an icon of Saint Simeon of Verkhoturya, the very saint who, according to him, appeared to him in a dream. This icon remained with the Romanovs until their death. Exactly what Rasputin said to the emperor and empress is unknown, but he made a strong impression. Nikolai even recommended to Prime Minister Stolypin to invite the peasant to his sick daughter. The conversation, which lasted for 5 minutes, lasted more than an hour, the Tsar wrote. Is it possible to believe that Nicholas was struck by a simple peasant? Unlikely. But it's not about hypnosis, as detractors like to claim. Everything was more complicated. Nikolai was looking for a man from the people who would emphasize his connection with ordinary people. And Rasputin was ideally suited for this role. He acquired special value to the imperial family after his prayers began to alleviate the suffering of Alexei's heir. It is still unclear how this happened. Believers believed that it was a miracle. The opponents say it's witchcraft. Modern researchers explain otherwise. Rasputin forbade giving the boy medications, especially aspirin. Namely, he, diluting the blood, increased internal bleeding in hemophilia, so the refusal of treatment could really temporarily alleviate the condition of the heir. Imagine the Empress and the Emperor. In front of them is a man, simple and sincere, who also saved their long-awaited son. Can they be blamed for trust? But this was not enough for Rasputin. He knew that once wasn't enough. We need to gain a foothold. And soon he found allies in high society. The main one was the maid of honor and close friend of the Empress, Anna Virubova. Most of the letters to the Emperor went through her, and rumors attributed an even closer connection between them and Rasputin. Becoming the confessor of the Romanovs, Gregory strengthened his position. The clergy also saw him as a defender. With his help, they managed to get rid of competitors, foreign mystics and fools. Rasputin, like a shark, displaced all the small fish. He had a particularly close relationship with Bishop Hermogenes, who continued the work of John of Kronstadt. It was he who introduced Elder Gregory to a young monk who was to play a significant role in his fate. Iliodor, unlike Rasputin, was an educated man. He graduated from the seminary and studied at the St. Petersburg Theological Academy. However, religion always remained in the background for him. First of all, he was an adventurer. Iliodor tried to make his way to the court of the royal family, using acquaintances with the fool Mitya Kozelski, but this did not bring success. The elder and the monk formed an alliance, becoming a real gift for journalists of that era. According to one story, they allegedly flew over Tsaritsyn in an airplane, looked out for intellectuals with glasses, and sprayed them with red paint. It was an absurd fiction, but such rumors were readily believed. Rasputin underestimated Ilyodor's ambitions. He was not going to be content with the role of the second in their tandem, and began spreading compromising material. He said that Gregory allegedly visited the residence of Tsaritsyn to exorcise demons, but for some reason he did it in a bathhouse. Their friendship ended, and the real war began. However, it hardly affected the elder's public reputation at that time. Rasputin was at the zenith of his fame. His image seemed to be covered with Teflon. Any dirt bounced off. In St. Petersburg, the Siberian elder managed to climb the political Olympus of the empire. We have already discussed why he turned out to be the royal family's court confessor and was able to gain a foothold at court. Now let's figure out what kind of person he was. After his murder, the investigation recorded anthropometric data: height 6 feet 4 inches, weight 90 kg. Even today, such a figure would look impressive, but then he was noticeably taller than Nicholas II and Lenin. Only Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, the commander-in-chief of the Russian army at the beginning of the First World War, could compare with him in size. Rasputin's eyes were gray-blue, and his beard was thick and spade-like. The look, according to the memoirs of contemporaries, is piercing. The French ambassador wrote that he was both affectionate and wary, naive and cunning, attentive and distant. When Gregory lit up in conversation, his pupils seemed to radiate magnetism. The speech was controversial. Many found her charismatic, while others noted that she was rambling and incoherent. It was difficult to follow his thoughts. He often talked to himself and slapped his thighs. Rasputin wore either church or peasant clothes, but over time, his shorts became more and more refined. At the celebration of the tercentenary of the House of Romanov, he shone. A dark crimson silk shirt, high patent leather boots, black trousers, and a black undershirt. He looked like a real star. The question arises, where did he get the money from? The elder did not have an official salary. The main income came from donations. On average, his well-wishers gave him about 100 rubles a month, the amount with which he could buy a good horse, 5 pairs of officers' boots, or rent a 2-bedroom apartment in the center of St. Petersburg for a couple of months. Not bad, though not luxurious for a man in his position. The banker Filipov, a friend of Rasputin, recalled that he lived simply, even poorly. When asked if the emperor was helping him, Gregory replied, "Stingy. Passion is stingy." At first, he really lived extremely economically. He did not drink, often changed rented rooms. He managed to live on Karavanaya, Litani, Kirochnaya, and Nikolaevskaya streets, living with kind owners. His rooms always had simple furniture and his favorite rustic buffet table, which he carried from house to house. He certainly wasn't a symbol of greed back then. Rasputin received his own apartment only in 1913, a 4-room apartment. Today, the military department of one of the St. Petersburg universities is located there. General Veretennikov rented the apartment to him, hoping that the elder would put in a good word for him. The accommodation was modest, but exotic. There was a telephone. We even know Gregory's number, 6.4646. A year later, Rasputin began to grow rich dramatically, using his influence at court. His apartment has become a center of attraction for dozens of petitioners who are willing to pay substantial sums for a note from the elder. There were a lot of them. The Empress took them for granted, but the Emperor was furious. Nicholas II bluntly told Gregory that it was time to stop underground services, because for this he was not invited to the courtyard. But Rasputin did not care about the Tsar's words. By the beginning of the war, he had already made a fortune. A 2-story house in his native Pokrovsky, where his wife lived, and a 5-room apartment in St. Petersburg. The latter looked like the dwelling of a well-to-do bourgeois. Today there are guided tours. One of the rooms is even rented daily. Over time, the old image of the humble and God-fearing pilgrim disappeared. He was increasingly seen in the best restaurants of St. Petersburg. The Bear and Donon, in the company of prostitutes and gypsies. Supporters of the version of his slander claim that it was not Rasputin himself, but a kind of double. But information about the deputy appeared only after his death, and even then it is extremely scarce. During his lifetime, he had been monitored since 1912, and the reports recorded everything. For example, he rarely went outside without a purpose. If he went out, he took a prostitute on Sinaya Square and went with her to a hotel or a sauna. Or he molested women with vulgar proposals right in the street. Some responded with threats, others spat in his face. Thus, by the time of his fall, his image was no longer a legend, but a fact. And he was still sober. When I drank, the outrages began. In March 1915, for example, at the Yar restaurant in Moscow, he pulled down his trousers, showed his genitals, and boasted that he was wearing a shirt embroidered by the Empress. Bulgakov, according to some, could have written off the behavior of Stepka Likodiv in The Master and Margarita from these episodes. History shows that Rasputin was not a scoundrel from the very beginning, but big money and influence corrupted him. He justified fornication to himself with the words, "If you do not sin, you will not repent." But the promotion of henchmen, drunkenness, and debauchery became the very kind of overkill that could no longer be forgiven even at court. The Empress still remained by his side. She knew about the complaints. Even the maids wrote that he molested them. But she closed her eyes. The health of her son, Alyosha, was the most important thing to her. Meanwhile, the ground under the elder's feet began to burn. Rasputin's growing influence scared everyone. The number of enemies multiplied. Friends turned away. Among them was the same Bishop Hermogenes. At one of the meetings in 1911, he tried to reason with Rasputin, but the conversation turned into a quarrel. Hermogenes began to exorcise the devil from him and beat him on the head with a cross. Grigory resisted. In the end, the bishop's supporters threatened the elder with a saber and forced him to swear that he would not appear at court again. But he broke his promise. It became a perjury. After that, almost all the court clergy turned their backs on him. Representatives of the synod began to check him, and the press increasingly linked Rasputin's name with the Klist sect. During the rituals, these mystics tortured themselves with whips, entered into a trance, and allegedly ended the rituals with orgies. The official church was not going to tolerate this, and since the officials were well aware of the elders' adventures with prostitutes, the accusation of having ties with the whips looked quite plausible. This was not the first such blow for Rasputin. Previously, his friends at the church helped him out, but now he could no longer count on them. Someone was trying to break into the highest circles of power. Someone dreamed of removing the emperor and installing another ruler, and someone was waiting for the revolution. In such an atmosphere, the elder proved to be a convenient symbol of the troubling currents of the era. In March 1910, Moskovsky Vedomosti published a large article entitled "Spiritual Guest Grigory Rasputin." This is actually the first public defeat of the court elder. The materials denounced him as a charlatan and an upstart, accusing him of hypnosis and exploiting female fans. It is interesting that this conservative, loyal to the monarchy publication was published. The author of the text was Mikhail Novoselov, and the editor was the leftist monarchist Lev Tikhomirov. After the publication, a wave of attacks swept through the press. Both socialists and cadets joined the cause. In 1 month, a lot of materials appeared that painted Rasputin's reputation. Too many people had accumulated complaints. Soon the story spread beyond Russia. European and American newspapers wrote about the elder's growing influence on the emperor and empress. Vladimir Burtsev, who was called the Russian Sherlock, also used the theme of Rasputin in the foreign press. The writer Ekaterina Radziwill and foreign publications actively replicated versions of the lustful and treacherous Rasputin. Correspondence also played an important role. Letters from the Empress to the elder, full of warm, enthusiastic addresses. "Beloved, my unforgettable teacher." It is still unclear exactly how the world found out about these messages. Many experts consider them to be a forgery attributed to Ilyodor, and then spread through the Tibetan doctor Badmaev. When the letters fell into the hands of the deputies, rumors about the proximity of the empress and the elder spread rapidly through the press. By the beginning of the First World War, this topic was already actively used by hostile propaganda. Leaflets mocking the Romanovs and their pillar, Rasputin, were dropped over the trenches. For society, the authenticity of the facts has receded into the background. The combination of true and fictional episodes has created a lasting image that has not been turned around. By 1916, Rasputin's removal had become a matter of time. Caricatures and ridicule appeared everywhere. The authority of the monarchy was rapidly declining. According to the conspirators, the motivation for the murder was patriotic rage. This is how Prince Felix Yusupov, Grand Duke Dmitry, and other participants explained their act. The conspiracy included people from different backgrounds: deputies, officers, representatives of the nobility, and Felix Yusupov himself became the face of the operation. According to legend, Yusupov lured Rasputin into the basement of his palace, offered him a feast, and poured potassium cyanide into the cakes. Allegedly, the poison did not work. Then Yusupov shot the elder in the back. He fell, and the conspirators tried to stage the transportation of the body, disguising the participant in the conspiracy in Rasputin's clothes and taking the corpse to the elder's house to disrupt surveillance. But an unexpected turn took place in the basement. The elder allegedly jumped up, clung to Yusupov, and tried to escape. Later, Purishkevich approached him and fired several more shots. After that, the body was wrapped up and dumped in the sink. According to the classical version, Rasputin was 47 years old. However, the recollections of the participants, primarily Yusupov, are not considered to be the absolute truth. The doctor who accompanied the conspirators later wrote that there was no poisoning. Supposedly harmless powder got into the products. There were also more exotic rumors about microdoses of poison, with which the elder supposedly brought immunity to the poison. But this looks implausible. The official autopsy put the dots on the I. No poison was found in the body. There was no water in the lungs. That is, there was no drowning. There were 3 wounds, and all of them were considered fatal, and one of them was a point-blank shot in the forehead. This refuted the romantic versions of miraculous survival after several bullets. Nevertheless, there were alternative versions. One of them is the English trace. Even in the first days after the murder, they talked about the involvement of British agents, pointing to the connections of Felix Yusupov and some British acquaintances. Over time, researchers found different evidence and versions. Someone claimed that 3 people shot in the case, and 1 bullet was fired from a British-made revolver. On the other hand, the prosecutor who led the investigation in early 1917 noted that the murder itself looked extremely clumsy. It did not look like a special services operation. The archives also did not confirm the apparent involvement of British agents in the overnight case. The point is that the details of the murder, no matter how intriguing, are only part of the bigger picture. To consider one sensation in isolation from the general history of Rasputin and the last years of the empire is to miss the main thing. His figure and environment became a symptom of a deep disease of the then government and society. If you look at the whole picture, it becomes clear. The tragedy in the Yusupov Palace was only part of the general crisis of the dying Russian Empire. Focusing solely on the details of the murder or the search for conspiracies makes it difficult to understand Rasputin's holistic image and the last years of his life. With so many enemies who hated him wholeheartedly, he could not expect a natural death. What happened to the killers? The Empress demanded that they be executed, but no one dared to take such harsh measures. Yusupov was sent into exile to his luxurious estate in Rakitny. After the February Revolution, he moved to the Crimea and then went to France, where he lived out his life. Purishkevich, on the contrary, did not live long. After October, he hid from the Bolsheviks and died of typhus. Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich was exiled to the Persian front, which saved his life and allowed him to leave Russia. Later he lived in Europe, had an affair with Coco Chanel, and settled in France. Lieutenant Sukhotin escaped punishment, married Leo Tolstoy's granddaughter, and died abroad. Dr. Lazaver also left the country and died in Paris. None of the participants in the conspiracy suffered real punishment. Interestingly, in France, Yusupov and Dmitry Pavlovich met Rasputin's daughter, Matrona. She filed a lawsuit against them, demanding compensation of $800,000, but the court did not consider it, It would seem that the story ended there. But no, Rasputin continued to live in myths even after his death. The stripped monk Heliodor ended up in the USA, where he published the book Holy Devil in 1917. In it, he claimed with fiction and speculation that Rasputin lived with Empress Alexandra, was the father of Alexei's heir, and actually ruled Russia. It was this book that became the basis of myths, and later, the inspiration for the famous Boney M song, Rasputin. In the post-Soviet space, the image turned out to be completely different. Soviet propaganda portrayed him as a symbol of the degradation of Tsarist Russia, an uneducated peasant running a weak emperor, sleeping with his wife, and interfering in the affairs of the state. It was important to show that the country was in decline, and only the Bolsheviks had saved it. At the same time, the myths themselves originated in the white and monarchical environment, and later they were picked up by Soviet historians. In the 1990s, an alternative image emerged: Rasputin as a holy elder, whose miracles and prophecies could have saved the country, but he was killed by internal enemies acting in the interests of foreigners. Both of these portraits are far from the truth. Rasputin was neither a saint nor a demon. He is a tragic figure, a harbinger of the decline of the empire, who found himself surrounded by an environment he was not prepared for. Myths, liberally seasoned with a grain of truth, became a fatal blow to the prestige of the crown, and the monarchy has not recovered from this blow. If you watched it with interest, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and forward it to your friends and acquaintances who are also interested in the topic of Rasputin and the events of the early 20th century.